On April 10, 1865, one day after Robert E. Lee handed his army over to Ulysses Grant, a Confederate general built like a bull and known across two armies for his stubbornness, stood in the yard outside the McLean House and watched Grant walk toward him. James Longstreet had spent 4 years trying to kill this man's soldiers. He had come astonishingly close to dying himself less than a year earlier, shot through the throat and shoulder by his own men in the tangled woods of the wilderness in an accident eerily similar to the one that had killed Stonewall Jackson in the same forest a year before. Friendly fire in the near-blind chaos of fighting among trees so thick that units lost track of exactly where the enemy ended and their own side began. He had recovered against real odds and returned to command months later with his right arm never fully working again. He had lost a brother-in-law in the war. He had watched his own army starve, had watched Pickett's division get shredded at Gettysburg on an assault he'd argued against, had signed his name to a surrender he believed was the only thing standing between his men and total annihilation. He walked toward Grant that morning, bracing for something formal. A handshake, maybe. A few correct, careful words between two men who had just finished trying to destroy each other's countries. Grant said one word, and Longstreet, a man who had stood unmoved through some of the worst combat of the entire war, a man who had nearly bled to death on a Virginia road less than a year earlier, could not speak. That word is what this video is about. Not the surrender itself. That story has been told 1,000 times. This is about the 4 seconds after it, in a muddy Virginia yard, when the general who had just conquered the South said one syllable to an old friend and broke him completely open. None of that makes sense without going back further than the war itself, to who these two men were before either of them ever put on a uniform meant to be used against the other. Long before Longstreet wore Confederate gray and Grant wore Union blue, they were young officers together, cadets at West Point in the early 1840s, and later comrades stationed in the same peacetime army in Louisiana and Texas. They were close in the specific way young soldiers become close when there is nothing to do most nights but pass the time. They played cards constantly, a game called brag, an old precursor to poker. And Grant, by his own admission and everyone else's, was terrible at it. He lost to Longstreet again and again. When Grant married Julia Dent in 1848, Longstreet stood beside him as best man. Julia Dent was, in fact, Longstreet's cousin. The two men were already tied together by family before the war ever separated them by uniform. And it was Longstreet who had, decades earlier, given Grant a nickname nobody else used. Everyone else in the army called him Sam, short for Uncle Sam, a joke about his initials. And Grant called him Pete. Nobody remembers exactly why. It just stuck, the way nicknames do between people who trust each other enough not to need a reason. In the small, closed world of the antebellum army, postings like the one in Texas threw young officers together for months at a time with almost nothing to occupy them beyond drilling, letter writing, and each other's company. Friendships formed in those garrisons tended to run deep precisely because there was so little else competing for a man's attention. Grant, in later years, described that period of his life with a fondness he rarely extended to much else about his time in the peacetime army, and Longstreet's name came up in those recollections more than almost anyone else's. Then came 1861, and the two men who had once lost card games to each other in a Texas garrison found themselves commanding armies built to kill each other's soldiers by the tens of thousands. Longstreet became Lee's most trusted corps commander, the General Lee called his war horse, a man whose tactical judgment Lee relied on more than almost anyone else's in the Army of Northern Virginia. Grant rose through the Western theater with a reputation for a kind of relentless, unglamorous competence that eventually put him in command of every Union army in the field. Their paths crossed only once in actual combat, briefly at the Wilderness in May 1864, where their forces engaged each other directly for the first and only time in 4 years of war. Beyond that single encounter, they spent the conflict as abstractions to each other, names on the other side of a battle line, men their soldiers were trying to kill on their orders, with no personal contact at all. By April 1865, whatever affection had existed between them had been buried under 4 years of the worst violence either man had ever witnessed. Longstreet had commanded troops that killed Grant's soldiers at the Wilderness, at Petersburg, in a dozen engagements across Virginia. Grant had commanded the army that had finally, after 4 years of failed Union offensives under other generals, ground Lee's forces down to starvation and surrender. Whatever the two men had been to each other in Texas belonged to a version of both of them that the war had, by most reasonable expectations, erased. Longstreet did not expect friendship at Appomattox. He expected formality, if he expected anything decent at all. Before the surrender meeting even took place, Longstreet had told Lee that he trusted Grant's terms would be fair, that whatever Grant offered would be terms Lee himself would have offered under reversed circumstances. That was already, in its way, a remarkable statement for a defeated general to make about his conqueror. But trusting a man's fairness and expecting warmth from him are two entirely different things, especially the day after you've surrendered everything you spent 4 years fighting for. On April 10th, the two sides were still working through the details of the parole process at the McLean House, sorting out the paperwork that would let Lee's soldiers go home. Grant saw Longstreet across the yard, and instead of the correct distant greeting that protocol and 4 years of war would have justified, Grant crossed the space between them, extended his hand, and said it with the same cheerful, unguarded tone he'd used back in Texas 20 years earlier, like no war had ever happened at all. Pete. One word, a nickname from a version of each of them that existed before Fort Sumter, before Manassas, before either man had ever ordered a soldier to his death. Grant followed it with an invitation. "Let's have another game of brag," he said, to recall the days that were so pleasant to us all. But the word that did the damage had already landed. Longstreet, describing the moment decades later, said his heart swelled out at what he called a magnanimous touch of humanity. He asked himself in that instant why men who were born to be brothers had given 4 years of their lives to killing each other. A general who had stood through 4 years of the worst fighting in the country's history without visibly breaking was, for a moment, unable to answer his old friend at all. What makes the moment remarkable is not that Grant was being generous. Grant was, by every account, a genuinely generous man at Appomattox. The surrender terms themselves were proof of that, allowing Confederate soldiers to keep their horses and go home without prosecution. What makes this particular moment different is the precision of it. Grant did not choose a speech. He did not choose a gesture calculated for the history books. He chose the single smallest, most private thing he had, an old nickname that only he and a handful of people from a peacetime garrison 2 decades earlier would have remembered to use. And he used it exactly the way he always had, as if the intervening war were an interruption rather than an ending. That is what silenced Longstreet, not sympathy, not ceremony, recognition. In a yard full of men negotiating the mechanical details of a nation's rupture, Grant had found the one word capable of reminding his old friend that he was still underneath the uniform and the surrender and everything the last 4 years had cost both of them. Somebody Grant had never stopped considering a friend. Longstreet went on to become one of the most controversial figures in post-war Southern memory, in part because he never disowned that moment or the friendship behind it. He joined the Republican Party. He served in the Grant administration. He defended Grant publicly for the rest of his life, at real personal cost among former Confederates who considered his loyalty to Grant close to betrayal. When Grant died in 1885, Longstreet was among those who mourned him most visibly and most publicly, telling a reporter on the day of Grant's death that he had lost one of the finest men he had ever known. Whatever cost Longstreet paid for that loyalty, it traced back in a straight line to a muddy yard in April 1865, and to a single word that reminded him, at the worst moment of his life, that some things the war hadn't managed to destroy after all. There is a particular kind of power in that. Grant could have said anything to Longstreet that morning. He could have offered condolences or formal respect, or simply nothing at all. Silence would have been forgivable, even expected, between two men on opposite sides of a surrender. Instead, he reached backward, past everything the war had done to the country, and pulled out the one word that still belonged to who they'd been before any of it started. It cost him nothing to say. It cost Longstreet, for one unguarded moment in front of his own defeated army, every bit of composure he had left.